gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce Doug Gibson, who's been one of the central figures in Canadian publishing for decades. Doug started out as an editorial trainee at Doubleday in 1968. He moved up the ranks quickly and found himself running the editorial department at the age of 25. In 1974, he joined Macmillan as the editorial director and became publisher in 1979. In 1986, he joined McClelland and Stewart as editor and publisher, and he started his own editorial imprint, Douglas Gibson Books, and this was the first editorial imprint in Canada. He has presented at EAC conferences and conducted EAC seminars, and contributed the title chapter for EAC's booklet, author and editor.
That's not an EAC book.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's a Writers Union book.
I'm so glad you're here, Ruth. My apologies in the audience. I know.
Ground.
I know. So over the course of his long and illustrious career, Doug has had the occasion to work with some of the greatest Canadian literary talents, and I'm very excited to say that he's going to be introducing us to some of these characters. This is the second act of his one-man show. There will be other opportunities to see the full show. I hope you will go out and watch it. And the show is based on, has been developed and adapted from Doug's memoirs. You can see the cover here, Stories About Storytellers, and that's forthcoming from ECW Press in October. So, unfortunately, we don't have copies for sale now, but I hope this will wet your whistle for the book when it's published. So without further ado, Doug Gibson.
Thank you very much, Alison. This is not the first time, as Alison mentioned, that I've been involved in speaking to the EAC. I don't know if any of you are old enough to have been, about 15 years ago, to the EAC conference in Ottawa.
Yep.
And that was where I was introduced by a very nice, conscientious young woman who said that she had been hard at work writing the introduction to Doug Gibson, and her roommate said, "What are you doing?" And she said, I have to introduce Douglas Gibson, and I'm preparing that. And the roommate said, "Douglas Gibson, as in Douglas Gibson Books? You mean that's a real person?" She thought I was a kind of Betty Crocker, Ronald McDonald figures, a sly marketing device to sell books. So there you go. Yes, this is the real Doug Gibson. Alison asked me to give a talk here some time ago, and I said I was pleased to do it. I think it was on history of Canadian publishing. And then things sort of developed because I finished the book, and I thought I could do an interesting talk entitled "Harder Than I Thought. A Publisher Tries to Write a Book." And I've given such a talk, and I have interesting things to say, I think, about the basic fact that, surprise, surprise, books do not write themselves. And I learned this. But then in the course of having written the book and having found a publisher, and I'm delighted to see a sturdy representation from ECW Press come in with perfect timing, yes, yes. I've learned a lot about the publishing process from the other side of the fence. But I've also learned, I think, a bit about storytelling. And the great light shone down upon me, and I thought, wait a minute. The book is called Stories About Storytellers. It consists of stories. I can take this show on the road and tell stories. So what I'm going to do is give you the second half of the performance, and I'll just whiz through, and I've passed a self-denying ordinance that as I show you Tony Jenkins' caricatures, Tony does not do flattery. But if I'm willing to subject other people, the authors, who are the subject of these mini biographies, to his treatment, it's only fair that I should suffer myself. So there you go.
Did you deliberately wear the same tie?
I'm a good sport. I deliberately wore the same tie. So I'm going to whiz through the first half, then we get to the intermission, And then after the intermission, it will be the real show, not just me chatting to my friends at the EAC. So let's go. But I'd like to begin Peter Newman piece by a direct quote, which goes, "That bastard Newman, you can't trust him." And the man uttering these indignant words was my boss at Doubleday Canada, a man named David Manuel. And he held in his hand two pieces of paper. And one was the copy of a letter from Peter St. Newman to him saying he was very sorry, he was not going to be able to keep his contract, he was returning the money because he was not going to deliver the promised book. That was disappointing. But on the other hand, he had a letter to Jack McClellan saying, "Dear Jack, this should fool those guys at Doubleday." And so David Manuel, who was a witty fellow, simply sent the letter back to Peter Newman saying, "This seems to have gone to the wrong person." And we were waiting to see how can you get out of it? And I guess we were secretly glad that Peter didn't belong to a culture where Harry Carey was a possibility. You know, this terminal embarrassment. Not for Peter. Back comes a cheery letter saying, "Oh gosh, well, the males nowadays, you never know who's going to be elected." And he spreads goodwill around to everyone. He was, and right there, that was 1968, right there I learned that Peter Newman was not a saintly fellow. And he was going to be interesting to watch. And of course he's been interesting for all of us to watch, because he was, as you're aware, a refugee who just got away from the Nazis as a young Czechoslovak, and made it briefly to London and then to Canada, age of 13. And he's always been, I would argue, a refugee, a guy sensing where the power is. And in fact, if you want to do an interesting piece of research, check how many of his books have the word power in the title or the subtitle, or even the opening line. He's really a power seeker, as I've said. But he's always been the refugee who tries to figure out who's in charge here, who do I have to befriend? Although an enemy has said that Peter Newman doesn't have any friends, he has sources. Anyway, I've known Peter down through the years. We always rubbed up against each other, and eventually I had the pleasure of working with him as his editor in 2004, when he was doing his memoirs, Here Be Dragons, and Power, Stories of People, Passion, and Power. And it was fascinating, and it did very well. And I enjoyed working with him, and he had fun. And he gave away the secrets of his publishing success. He told us about his Hey Mabel trick. And the Hey Mabel trick is you every so often include a story that is so outrageous that the reader at home says, "Hey Mabel, listen to this." For example, and I apologize in advance if anyone is going to faint dead away at this story. In that book, he's writing about Barbara Emile's time in London before she met Conrad Black. He writes that when Algie Clough, chairman of The Spectator, invited her on a dinner date, she accepted, but warned him, "There's one thing I have to tell you, I won't be wearing any knickers." Now, the correct response, of course, is to ask, is that a threat or a promise? But good old Algie, who's presumably a refugee from some P.G. Wodehouse novel, Algie Clough's response is not noted. Now, Peter is remarkable because he invented types of books, became the master of that type, and then moved on. So, for example, with Renegade and Power, he invented, in Canadian terms, the disrespectful, hard-hitting Canadian political biography. Boom. And you'll recall that John Diefenbaker, who was not a grateful recipient of this treatment, called him the bouncing Czech. Not that he bore any ill will to the fine people of Czechoslovakia, it just was not intended to be a praising reference. And then he decided that corporate power was going to be the next big thing, and he wrote The Canadian Establishment, and spin-off after spin-off after spin-off of that. Huge successes, they became associated with Peter Newman. And then he decided that Canadian history was not necessarily just Pierre Burton's parish, and he significantly signed a $500,000 contract with Penguin to do the 2-volume history of the Hudson Bay Company. And he was ahead of the game. This was before the big foreign companies were coming in and pouring lots of big money into advances. Peter was the first one, Penguin Canada, and he left McClellan and Stewart to do that. And he's still hard at work doing new stuff. And I must say, I'm full of admiration for his determination and his hard work. I mentioned Barbara, Emile, and knickers. Peter himself is something of an authority on knickers. His fourth wife, Alvy, once overheard, he's had 3 wives and God knows what else. And his astonishingly frank memoir gives an exhausting list of ladies, an exhaustive list of ladies that he's got to know very well indeed. And he tells us that when he was hard at work on a book, writing to the music of Stan Kenton, he'd get up at 4:30 in the morning. But he would take promising prospects to dinner the evening before. And around dessert, he would say to them, look, I have to be in bed by 9:30 with you or without you. And he tells us this was astonishingly successful. So look for a totally new type of book for Peter Newman, the Peter Newman Dating Guide. And it will show that he's come a long way from the days when he claims that he graduated from Upper Canada College so innocent about sex that he believed that oral sex meant that you talked a good game. Here Be Dragons was a huge success, and a very interesting bystander through all this was another of my authors, a fellow named Brian Mulroney. You may recall that Mulroney and Peter Newman had a deal that they would work as a team, and that every 10 days, couple of weeks, Peter Newman would go to Mulroney's office, Prime Minister's office, and then they would sit and he would tape record what was happening in Mulroney's life. He was going to be the bossman, and it was going to be a remarkable inside picture of what really happened in the Prime Minister's life. Something went wrong between them. It may have been the word team. In any case, it was wiped out, nothing was happening. But Mulroney was still interested in my old friend Peter Newman's book. How's it doing? And I would tell him his book was doing very well, and Brian would pretend to be pleased. And Peter, of course, was aware that I was working with Brian on his forthcoming memoirs. Now, Peter's book did so well that, like a good publisher, I was working really hard to get him to sign up to do his next book with me. And somehow he was always absolutely in favor. Oh, absolutely, yeah, I'm keen to do it. Enjoy working, yeah. But it was never quite the right time. Well, I'm off on this magazine assignment. Oh, I'm doing this. And so I never actually got to sign him up. And this was a bit of a mystery to me until the day when my lovely wife Jane, who is an early riser, came into the bedroom at 7 o'clock and said, I think you'd better see this. And this was the front page of the Globe and Mail saying, Mulroney tapes revealed in secret Newman book. You know, headlines blown up. I got 2 really interesting phone calls that day. That morning. The first one was Peter Newman. And this was about 9 o'clock, and he was delighted. Hey Doug, he's in the club now. See, well, I guess you don't know why I didn't want to do the next book with you. he was delighted that he was the kid who'd built a stink bomb in the chemistry class, set it off, and boom, it was true. And he was so thrilled with himself, I couldn't stay mad at him in terms of barking his friend. The next phone call was slightly different. And it was from a slightly different personality. It was from this man. And it tells a lot about Brian Mulroney, because he knew how small the world of Canadian publishing is. He knew that I'd been Peter Newman's editor and publisher. And he knew how hard it would be for a major book like this to be concealed from me. But instead of leaping to accuse me, as might have happened and would have led to hard words, he said, I take it you knew nothing about this Peter Newman book. I said, that's right, fine. I read about it first time in the Globe and Mail this morning. Okay, he's betrayed both of us. He proceeded to do something about it. And what he did, since you all know the way the law is going to work, you can't publish tapes of someone who has not agreed to have the tapes published. And I believe that the Hospital for Sick Children is now a great deal richer thanks to Brian Mulroney's lawsuit. It was an interesting morning, but it was always interesting working with this man. People say, what was it like working with Brian Mulroney? Did you like it? And the answer is yes. I liked the experience and I liked working with him. For a start, he wrote every single word of the manuscript in longhand himself. And to emphasize that in a world where not only hockey stars, but prime ministers and so on have ghostwriters, it's so remarkable to have someone who wrote his own book, word for word, that I, you may recall, ran pages from the manuscript, handwritten in the end papers. People could say, wow, he really did write this. So that was one piece of impressive background. And the other is I found him businesslike, and I found him very good at man management. You guys are publishing pros, so you'll understand what this is all about. He had a research director named Arthur Milne, and they've been saying, okay, when is the last time we can make any changes? And I said, okay, the last proofs go to the printer on Friday, so no changes. And on Friday morning, I got a call from Arthur Milne. And he said, he calls him the boss. The boss wants to make some changes. And I said, it's too late. Just too late. No. I mean, it's going off to the printer today. And he said, I told the boss you'd say that. But you know what he said? You told him that I know that he's the finest editor in Canada. And I know that he would never knowingly allow a book to go through that he could have corrected. I swore aloud, and I ran through to the typesetting folks, and we made the change. And the courier came to take it to the printer 10 minutes later. Now that was really, think of that, smart management. He got Arthur Milne to do the dirty call, and it worked. And I realized I was being flattered, but it worked. It worked. So I enjoyed working with him, and I am largely the man to blame if you feel that this 1,100-page book about his life was too long. Because I sat down with him at his Montreal law office, and if you wonder what sort of law office does a former Prime Minister have, it was decorated just like a really rich person's cottage. So lots of rustic this and that, and couches and old armchairs and so on. And he sat there and he said, Doug, am I spending too much time on Baie Comeau? And I said, no. Absolutely not. You're doing a lot about growing up in Baie-Comeau, but don't cut it at all, because in every sense, it tells the reader where you come from. And you'll see I described him there, and deliberately as a boy from Baie-Comeau, and I believe that you understand Mulrooney if you understand he grew up in this company town 14 hours away from the nearest city, Quebec City. 14 hours. So he was always the outsider, always the guy worried about money. And they grew up so poor, in fact, that he and his brother had to sleep in the basement around the basement heater so that they could free up a room for a paid lodger to come in and bring in some cash, simply to get the family through. And when you read that sort of detail, you start understanding this man. So I enjoyed working with him, I came to admire him, and I find that the book itself is a remarkable book by a remarkable man, now sadly fighting diabetes, and I wish him well. The next man is a very different sort, although he's only 2 years younger than Brian Mulrooney, but he comes from an entirely different generation. This is Robert Hunter, Bob Hunter, the man who founded Greenpeace. And he died in 2005, born just 2 years after Brian Mulrooney, but as I say, different generation. He was the long-haired hippie columnist who introduced blue jeans, gasp, to the Vancouver Sun newsroom. And when the Americans thought it might be a good idea to set off a nuclear bomb in Anchica, Bob and a number of other Vancouverites didn't like the thought of the tsunami that might roll their way. And so they held a concert with big names like Phil Oakes and Joni Mitchell and James Taylor. And they raised enough money to buy a fishing boat, and they sailed it towards the nuclear explosion. It was later renamed the Greenpeace. And Bob Hunter was on board typing up a storm. So it didn't work, it didn't at all. But it started Greenpeace, and Bob Hunter was the original member, the #1 card carrier, and the genius who set the Greenpeace pattern. So anytime you see Greenpeace, which is of course now a huge worldwide organization, anytime you see them doing something really clever, imaginative, brave, and newsworthy, think of this guy, the witty, mischievous Vancouver guy who set that pattern, set the whole Greenpeace standard. It's no wonder that Time magazine named him as one of the 10 eco-heroes of the 20th century. But he was much too Canadian to stay content with being a world eco-hero. You may remember he had a city TV show where he sat in his bathrobe and each morning dissected the news, giggling and laughing. They're playing down the story because it's embarrassing for them. Oh. And he was just a witty, wonderful, funny guy. And he won Governor General's Award for his book, Occupied Canada. And then he wrote another, more relaxed book, Red Blood, about his relations over the years with his Aboriginal friends. And like all of Bob's work, it's very funny, irreverent stuff. And one of the nicest moments in my life is when we, as usual, were spending a lot of time together laughing, and a waitress down near the art gallery said, "Hey, are you guys brothers?" I like that. Now, Alistair McLeod. Alistair's people came to Cape Breton 200 years ago. He grew up there and he found that he was, in his modest words, good at school. And he worked his way, thanks to tough, demanding, blue-collar jobs that he's written about, all the way through university to a PhD. And then he became an English teacher at University of Windsor. And somebody here tonight has benefited personally from his teaching there. And he married Anita McClellan from down the road in Cape Breton, and they had 6 children together. And somehow, in the midst of raising these 6 kids, and spending the summers back in Cape Breton, he found time to write short stories. And the short stories were so perfect that when the first collection of 7 came out, it was a sensation. And then 7 years later, a second collection came out. And they were published all around the world, and the world recognized that we had an amazing short story writer. And they were so uniquely powerful that the two British authors behind the 100 best Canadian, actually 100 best modern English novels, deliberately bent the rules in the title by including Alistair's 2 short story collections. Speaks for itself. So when word got out that Alistair was writing a novel, people in Sydney, Australia, were just as interested as people in Sydney, Nova Scotia. And I was interested because I befriended Alistair when he taught, as if he wasn't busy enough, he taught at the Banff School of Writing, and along with W.O. Mitchell. And I admired him immensely as a reader, so I was encouraging him as best I could. But then when I became McClellan and Stewart's publisher in 1988, I inherited him, and suddenly it wasn't just a matter of it being nice if Alistair could finish this novel. It became very important for McClellan and Stewart's bottom line that he finished the damn novel. And so my twice yearly phone calls asking how it was going, which led to charmingly evasive responses from Alistair, were stepped up. And then after a bit, I started getting responses from MacLeod watchers. You know, remember Kremlin watchers in the days of the Cold War, who derived messages from the order on reviewing stands. MacLeod watchers would tell me that he'd read a different section of the book in Saskatoon. So I got the sense that there's more to read now. And so I stepped up the pressure, and I learned, in fact, one day that Alistair MacLeod had been in Toronto and was catching the 4:30 train back from to Windsor. So at 4 o'clock, the poor man is innocently sitting on a bench in Union Station, reading, and a bearded fellow sits down beside him and says, "Isn't this amazing? Here I am, patrolling Union Station, looking for a best-selling novel for this fall, and I happen to run into you." And he laughed, and it was all good fun. But I was making the point that this is serious. And then came the moment of the great misunderstanding, because I said, "Look, I get the sense that you're making good progress. Can you finish this in time for the fall?" He said, "Yes, I think so." What he meant was, "Yes, I can finish writing the book in the fall." What I heard with my eager, greedy publisher's ears was, "Yes, I can finish the book in time for you to get it and edit it and bring it out and publish it in the fall." And this led to something of a misunderstanding, because I put the book in the fall catalogue, and I wrote a terrific description of it, given that I had not read a single word of it. But interestingly, I chose to quote 2 lines of poetry in there, and the following 2 lines occur in the book, so clearly we were on the same wavelength. And then I really stepped up my campaign, so the poor man is being phoned, not quite daily, but more than once a week. And how's it coming? Can you send something to him? Well, it's coming, yeah, it's coming. And then eventually we had a sales conference, and I think you all know sales conference. People come from across the country to learn about the new books that you're publishing. And we had a sales conference on the next Tuesday, and I still haven't seen a word of this. So I phoned him Wednesday and I said, "Look, Alistair, this is what's happening. I'm coming to Windsor to get the manuscript." He said, No, it's not ready, don't come, don't come. I thought, "Oh." And I didn't answer the phone for a couple of days, and I had my assistant contact him on Friday morning saying, "Doug really is coming, you know." Alistair now describes my beneficent visit as a home invasion. And I showed up at the door armed with a bottle of Talisker. from the appropriate part of the Highlands. So that helped ease the way in, but it was a somewhat reserved response from Alistair. And Alistair and Anita and I, we were old friends, sat and chatted, but there was this elephant in the room. I come to seize the manuscript from this woman. And eventually I took out of my bag and laid a large envelope and said, now look, that's the contract, which I've spoken about, and in there is the check, the advance check that I've also spoken about. Now, what do you have for me? And I didn't refer to the fact that above the piano was the blood-chilling motto of the Clan MacLeod, which is, hold fast. I did not comment on it. And Alistair rose, went upstairs and came down carrying a manuscript, which I kept for the rest of the day. It wasn't quite a complete manuscript, because a visit to his Windsor University office showed that he writes in longhand. And because it was the summer, he was going to friends and begging for, could you type this page for me? And I swooned at that. This book was being held up because nobody was typing the manuscript, so he started sending it in to me. And he sent it in throughout the summer to the extent that once I called the MacLeod family house in Cape Breton, and one of many children answered, and I said, hi, this is Doug Gibson, this is the man who's ruining your dad's summer. And instead of laughing it off, he said, oh yes. So, the book came out, but even better, I did something unique at the sales conference. We brought everyone in and I said, just listen to this. And I said, that tune is called the Scottish tune called Neil Gow's Lament. And it's played on the occasion of a death in the novel. And that's the music that pervades Cape Breton, pervades Scotland earlier, and pervades this book. And the sound of the fiddle did much better work than my voice could have done. And I think you all know what happened. No Great Mischief, this book, became a huge success. It's certainly sold 500,000 copies by now. And it's sold all over the world. So that Alistair, who we visited, Jane and I visited this summer, tells me that Japanese tourists find their way to his corner of Cape Breton just to meet him and bow at him. And he bows back. He recognized a great master. And I must say, despite the home invasion accusation, it's always been wonderful working with Alistair. One of the best memories of my publishing life was going to Dublin Castle to see Alistair receive the Man Booker Prize for No Great Mischief. And after dinner in the gilded dining room, all of the black-tied guests came back to the great receiving room, and a group of folk musicians, young guys, were there. And young Kenneth MacLeod, Alistair's son, is a professional fiddler, and he brought his fiddle along. He went in and joined in with them, and then he went one more, and the next thing you know, they're playing a Cape Breton reel. And Alistair and the rest of the MacLeod family are forming a set, bringing in Jane Urquhart, and they're doing their stuff and twirling. And it was great. And the black-tie guests are clapping and whooping. And the PR guy who, from London, runs the Man Booker Prize said to me, my God, this is amazing. In future years, people will say, that was a wonderful evening. And those of us who were here tonight will say, but you should have been here the year the Canadians came. And you notice that I've described him as a stone carver. That's because every word is perfect. and as a dancer, because he danced there. And by golly, sometimes people grow into the role that you artistically have ascribed to them. So Jane and I arrived to visit the MacLeod family in Kigbretton this summer. And at the end of an evening, he said, "Would you like to come square dancing with us?" So we got to go square dancing with Alistair and Anita MacLeod. It's great. Talking about Alistair at a conference in Scotland, I asked the rhetorical question, has success changed Alistair MacLeod? And there was a ripple of laughter around the room. They knew that Alistair remained the smiling, flat-cap guy who looks like, when a journalist said, a farmer come to market to town to sell his cows. And they know that he's the most grounded person you can imagine for all the success of No Great Mischief or the collected stories I love. And when he starts to read, after clearing his throat awkwardly, and as his voice gains strength and as the incantatory rhythm of the words begins to take hold, you can look around and people in the audience who have never heard the words oral tradition are just transfixed because they recognize that they're in the presence of an authentic, great artist. And I must say that the last line of his novel speaks for itself. All of us are better when we're loved. And all of us, I know, are better for any contact with Alistair MacLeod, either in person or through his wonderful books. There are millions of Canadians who know what comes next year, and what comes next, of course, is Good Morning. I'm Peter Zosky. This is Morningside. Peter was a remarkable man. I think I don't need to tell this audience just the hold that Morningside had on the Canadian imagination for 15 years in the 80s and 90s. 3 hours morning show. And he acted as a sort of uncle to the nation. Peter Newman described him as Canada's Boswell, which I think is good. I think the key to understanding Peter is that he was a romantic. I published his autobiography, The Private Voice, and there's a great story there about when he was 12 and he played on a pretty good football team in Gauld. My wife was a girl from Gauld. And he learned that the newspaper photograph, were sending a photographer to see these winning guys. So he put a Band-Aid across his nose to look tougher. And that's Peter. I think he was such a success on the radio because he was such a good writer. In other words, he had the writer's organized mind. And you may recall there were parodies by people like Bob Robertson of his questions that went around like that, but they always reached, he knew where he was going, organized mind. And a great respect for writers, which meant that in publishing, if you got an author on the Peter Zosky show, you knew that if it went well, you were going to sell thousands of books that would fly off the shelves. So there was a Peter Zosky effect long before there was an Oprah effect. Now, I mentioned I worked with him on a number of books, but sadly we never did get to work on what was going to be his great book. And that was his book about the North. The damn cigarettes got him. Yet there was a magical moment after his death when the North came to him. There was a memorial service at Frontier College, just south of Sinclair, because for Frontier College he had raised literally millions of dollars for Frontier College and literacy. And Susan Abukar stepped forward and sang Amazing Grace in an altitude. And somehow, magically, although we're looking at the downtown towers of Toronto, it's as if the skies were connecting all the way to the Arctic. It's very powerful. Val Ross, this is powerful too. what is Val Ross doing in this collection, because she only wrote one book for adults. Most of you will remember she was a fine writer about authors and books for both Maclean's and for the Globe and Mail. She wrote 2 prize-winning children's books, but she wrote only one book for adults. And it's this one here, Robertson Davies, the oral history. And she collected great stories about Robertson Davies. And the tragedy is that she was hard at work on it, and in November she was hit by brain cancer. And she finished writing the book on a Thursday in February, and she died on a Saturday. One of her finest pieces of journalism began with the story of a chicken suffer in Blythe, in Alice Munro country. And an American tourist, as she told the story, was having a chicken supper there, which was to raise money for the Blythe Theatre. And he stopped the waitress who was busily clearing the dishes and said, "Look, I understand there's a famous author around here. Could that be her?" And he indicated an auburn-haired, elegant lady sitting off by herself, looking thoughtful. And the harassed waitress paused and said, "Yes, that could be her." And then Alice Munro swept up the dishes and took them back to the kitchen. And that's Alice Munro. And this is Alice Munro too. The story catches Alice because she's the sort of no-nonsense, the sort of person who will work as a volunteer waitress at a chicken supper, who will perform a sly joke like that on a visitor. And she's absolutely down to earth. I think you all know that she grew up poor in Wingham, in Huron County, where to be a show-off was the worst possible crime. Who do you think you are? She made it through 2 years at Western by scrimping and even selling her blood for money. Married James Munro. Jim Munro, they went to Vancouver and then to Victoria, where they set up what is still a very successful bookstore and raised 3 daughters. And Alice started to write short stories at home, and after nearly 20 years of working away, she became, you know the way the press does it, an overnight sensation. She published her first collection, Dance of the Happy Shades, in 1968. It won the Governor General's Award and led to a couple of other books, and a great career seemed to be assured, except that something was terribly wrong. She was under such pressure to stop writing short stories that, in fact, and to get on with a novel, the real thing, that she found herself unable to write. This is my pearly gates moment. When I reach the pearly gates, when St. Peter says, "So what have you done in your miserable life worth getting in here?" I can say, I kept Alice Munro writing short stories. And St. Peter, if his English is any good, will say, "Holy smokes, Alice Munro, come on in!" It's true, and there is actually documentary proof of this that I only discovered a few years ago when I published Robert Thacker's very fine biography of Alice, where he quotes the letter that she wrote to Macmillan in 1986 explaining why she wanted to follow me to the new Douglas Gibson imprint. It wasn't against Macmillan, it was pro Doug Gibson for this role that he'd had in her life. And it's true, it doesn't sound like a stroke of genius to say, "Listen, Alice, if you want to go on writing short stories for the rest of your life, I will go on publishing your short stories. You will never, ever hear me ask you for a novel." 13 books so far, doing fine, and as I say, it's in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Everyone else was saying, "No, no, you have to stop this, get on to the real thing." So, and in this context, it's a pleasure to know that the London Times reviewer some years ago wrote about Alice's stories when reading her work, it is difficult to remember why the novel was ever invented. So over the years, what's it been like publishing Alice Munro as she rose to such prominence that one American critic in the Atlantic wrote that she is the living writer most likely to be read 100 years from now? Well, since she was picked up by the New Yorkers, where most of her stories are published, really the stories come in pre-edited. So my basic role is to hang on for the ride, whooping, cheering. In fact, I have 3 main roles. The first is to persuade Alice that we now have enough short stories for a new collection. And I have met with the response, well, I guess there's no getting out of it, because she really doesn't like all the hoopla that goes with being published, even when she restricts what she will do. And as you know, she'll even restrict herself to withdrawing from Gillard Prize nominations, to the fury of her publisher, despite everything her publisher could say. So number 1 is to extract the stories from her. The second, and this audience will appreciate the horror here, the second is to stop her rewriting the damn stuff. And the worst example was the very first book we worked together on, Who Do You Think You Are? And it was a Saturday afternoon. And I remember I had the groceries, boom, put down beside the phone, and it was Alice, and she did the usual countryman, how is everyone, etc. And then she said, what stage is my book at? And I said, oh, it's great, Alice, the printing starts on Monday. It's done, it's gone. And she said, oh, that's too bad, because I've written a new story for the second half, and I've changed the whole second half from first person to third person. And I wonder, could I come in and show you what I have? And she came in by train to the Macmillan office, and she handed over the new second half. And my cowardly colleague said, well, it's up to you, Doug, to decide. Because, of course, we're faced with the author has rewritten the second half. If we go with the changes, we will lose weeks of selling time, Christmas selling time of the new Alice Munro book. And I came back and said, yes, it's better the way she's rewritten it. Let's give up the weeks and do it right. And the printers, in fact, were so thrilled that we only lost about 10 days. They'd never had this. A whole second half of the book rewritten just as they were about to hit the print button. And it was, Who Do You Think You Are? Won endless prizes. So that's one of my main, I've mentioned 2 of my main tasks. The third one is to accept the prizes that she is not able to attend in person. And I'm now programmed so that if I'm sitting at a dinner anywhere and I hear the words, unfortunately, Alice Munro, I'm up and out of my chair. And it reached, and I know I'm going to be greeted with disgust and dismay. Oh. And it reached the point where there was an event at the Royal York Hotel, I think a Canadian booksellers event, where Stuart McLean was the MC, and he said, and the winner of the book of the year is Alice Munro! And, you know, searchlights play around the room, the theme from Rocky, possibly. And I'm coming up beside, and Stuart said, oh, it's Doug. I didn't say my old friend Doug Gibson, who did movie reviews for me for 3 years. No, it was just, oh, it's Doug. So all publishers are very good at disappointing people, either turning down the manuscript or, even worse, not producing the sales that the authors dreamt. So it's been a wonderful life. Stopping Alice from polishing her work at the last minute. But what's she really like? Well, since she came back to Huron County in 1974 and remarried Jerry Fremlin, she's been grounded there in that supposedly ordinary small-town world that she has made into literature. And I found that there are 2 Alice Munros. And one of them is the Alice Munro, who will come on Morley Callahan looking ill in the subway and will go out of her way to get him to the doctor's office. And this turns into a Morley story because she's helping the poor old guy across the road, and Morley turns and says, "You know what's the matter with your work, don't you?" Proceeding to tell her. And she's also the Alice who'll help out the local theatre and who will twist her luckless publisher's arm, at a time when nobody did this, to use recycled paper on her books. And that, of course, broke the dam. So, hey, Alice Munro goes with recycled paper. Oh, all right. And that has changed the whole purchase of paper. That was Alice, and it was my arm. And then there's the Alice who's so funny that we spend most of her time on the phone laughing. And the Huron County humour comes in at all sorts of times. For instance, when in summer 2 years ago, she won the Man Booker Prize for her lifetime's work. The event was held in Trinity College, Dublin. And we went to the cocktail party, reception and dinner. And by golly, to get to the reception, you go past the Book of Kells. And then we go upstairs, and there is the long room, this ancient 18th century room. And it's full of black-tied people having cocktails. And there is Alice, sitting quietly off by herself. And I was appalled. I said, "Alice, would you like to meet any people?" She said, no, I'm just taking it very quietly until after the presentation. And then the flash of Huron County, she looked up under her brows and said, "They might change their mind, you know." We didn't. And I must tell you, it's remarkable what a nice person she is. And a reviewer from BC Book World said that in the bitchy world of Canadian writers, he had never heard a bad word about Alice Munro, either as a writer or in person. And there's no rule, of course, that says a fine artist has to be a fine, upstanding person. But when we come across one, it's wonderful. And we should all count ourselves lucky that we know Alice Munro, and Alice Munro's time, and me most of all, for our happy 35 years together. And her generosity, you see, has even stretched to reading and providing the introduction to my book, Stories About Storytellers. And the introduction concludes with a typical Alice Munro joke. So, here's my pick of a book for those interested in writers, books, Canada, life, and all that sort of thing. That's Alice. We're very lucky to have lived in her time. I've kept this man till the end, because I think his death in 1998 marked a watershed for Canada. As you can imagine, a key part of my career as a Canadian publisher revolved around my getting to know Canada and Canadians. And this man, I think, more than any other, represented the old Canada. And by that I mean the Canada that felt it had its roots on the farm or in small towns, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. But Bill Mitchell, through his CBC series, Jake and the Kid, and through his great classic of Growing Up on Prairies, Who Has Seen the Wind, not only represented that old world, but he kept it going in our imaginations, and we loved him for it. I loved him, although he was a very difficult man to be around. I used to say he was incident prone. If you were walking on the street with WO and two pigeons collided and they both fell on your head, so you say, "Oh well, I'm with WO, makes sense." He lived life at full throttle and full decibel. I remember a dinner in a Victoria Hotel dining room when that distinctive crackly prairie voice was raised in anger at a recent TV, oh my God, live TV interview host. And Bill said, "So I said to him, when was the last time you had an erection?" Old ladies fainted into their seats. The matron Hubbard. He was a dangerous guy to be around. And I'll give you an example. I had the task of introducing him more than once. And the first time I went nervously up to the podium and I gave him a reverent introduction, and I described him as a man whose books have altered the course of Canadian literature. And W.O. got up to the podium and he leant on it like this and he said, "Oh, horseshit." So you only get caught once, right? So the next time, I had the occasion to introduce Mike, I was very rude and I talked about his unknown career, true, as a jockstrap salesman. And I even quoted his own term, self-description as a folksy old foothills fart. And then he came up, he adjusted his glasses and said, "The essential purpose of literature is..." He gave us 20 minutes of senatorial wisdom. I sat there blushing. Who was that? That ridiculous young man. Oh. He was terrible. He was an old Depression boy. And it was noted that when he wrote the scripts for Jake and the Kid, he wrote in a gopher squeak. And nobody could do a gopher squeak. But he could do a gopher squeak. And he got paid for it. And so thereafter, week after week, gophers were squeaking. Until this was noticed. And from a very high level of the CBC, a memo came down and the gophers squeaked no more. Editing him was full of surprises too. It involved lots of phone calls to the Calgary home that he shared with his wonderful wife, Myrna. And for, weeks, months, I thought that her full proper name was, "For Christ's sakes, Myrna." Once he was on a tough deadline, writing a book for us for the fall. And you can imagine the impact of a new W.O. Mitchell book on the budget to get it out for the fall. So we arranged a delivery schedule that do this chapter at the end of January, this one end of February, end of March, and the last one had to be finished and sent end of May. So I'd phone him, "January, this is great, Bill, excellent stuff, keep it coming. February, this is terrific, yeah, keep it coming." Yeah. All the way through until right at the end of May, I got a phone call saying, "It's done, I sent it off to you." I spent 20 minutes telling him what a great pro he was, how wonderful this was. Until the last chapter came in. It was terrible. It was rushed and all the action was taking place off stage. And it was just, it was really bad. So how do you tell that his latest work is simply no good? It's not easy. I lost sleep over it. And finally I prepared the phone call. And I sat at the desk and I phoned and I said, "Bill, you know I've been telling you as these chapters came in how good they are." "Yeah." "And you know I'm no good to you unless I level with you." "Yeah." "Well, this last chapter is not good enough." "I know." "What do you mean you know?" "Oh, hell, I just finished it to meet the deadline, but I'm rewriting it. It's no good. Don't worry about it." "Oh, you son of a..." And he put me through all that. But I loved him, and it was always interesting. And then the day that a phone call like that ended with him saying, "I get Myrna to finish the story for you," I knew that he was losing the battle with prostate cancer. So I came out to speak at the great Calgary event in his honor in the city's main theatre. It was hosted by Peter Zosky, and he noted that other Canadian writers might be richer or more famous abroad, but W.O. was, without doubt, the best loved writer in Canada. Bill was so sick that he was unable to be there, and Myrna read his chosen story in his place. It was a very moving evening. The next day I called to ask if I could come and see him. And Myrna and Orm, his son, his daughter-in-law, said, well, he had good days and bad days, but today was a good day, so he would recognize me. So to prepare for my predicted dismay at his appearance, I had a joke. So I went to see him, and he was lying in bed in the hospital bed they set up just off the kitchen. I said, hey, Bill, did you hear about Myrna last night? Turns out all these years we've had the wrong member of the Mitchell family reading your work. And he was mad as and shaking, and we were back to our usual insults. And that was fine. Although he said, the drugs are giving me are taking away my memory. And there didn't seem much to say about that. But I didn't know he was setting up his storyline. So we, Myrna and Orm and Barb made their excuses and left us to say whatever we knew would be our last farewells. And I tried to tell him what working with him and knowing him meant. Didn't do a very good job of it. And then the others came rushing in and said, Bill, the taxi's here. He's got to get to the airport. And he really has to leave now. So Bill stuck out a hand from his bed and shook my hand firmly and said, well, goodbye, Jimmy. And Myrna and Orman, this was all. And then he looked, and that same foxy smile was in his face. He knew what he was doing. And I got out of there, blundering out of there, marveling at the grace that turned a hard farewell into a brave joke. Goodbye, Bill. That there would be a question and answer session, so that's the second half of the show. The first half contains minor luminaries like Roberts and Davies. So, questions, comments, Rotten Tomatoes. Too long, too short, says us, my wife. Not enough music, too much music.
Perfect.
Yes, Terry. I'm sorry, my friend Terry Follis is with us. And thank you for coming, Terry.
Well, I loved it. It was wonderful. How many authors did you have to cut out? How difficult was it to come upon the list that graces this book?
It was very hard. You know, and I could, I'm not suggesting another book, but I could have included chapters about Andy Russell, the wonderful Western author, Grizzly Country, and so on. Or Donald Jack, the author of the Bandy Papers series, 3 Cheers for Me, etc., etc. And another author I toyed with is not an author at all, and that's Duncan Macpherson, the great cartoonist, whom I happened to luck into a friendship with and got to know very well, and in fact worked with him on his annual collection of cartoons. And it was interesting that when I went to the Toronto, Macpherson was such a wild man, that when I went to the Toronto Star building, people would say, "Hey Doug, what are you doing here?" And I'd say, "I'm just going up to visit Duncan Macpherson's office." And he'd smile and, "Oh, okay, good luck." So yeah, there were a number of authors. And of course, I restricted myself to the chapters that deal only with the authors I worked with as an editor. And as you guys know, you really get to know people well when you work as an editor. You know, I published thousands of people, but I edited hundreds or 100 books. So So it wasn't easy. So now, if I come on your work, Terry, a little earlier, next volume. Yes.
Yeah. I think that we all owe Doug a large favor, a large thank you, and one he's probably forgotten. But one of the things I did as chair of the committee that wrote the standard forward contract, I brought it into Doug when he was at Macmillan, which I think you, and the word was, I was going around seeing the publishers who were rumored to be not real thrilled, but they hadn't seen it. So I bring in my copy, and I can't remember whether it was you or Ed Carson who comes up with a wonderful line when you look
Must
at
have been me.
I think it was. And he looks through it, and he mutters nasty things about the writer's union, of course.
Oh, maybe it wasn't me.
And then he looks up and says, "This is wonderful. It's just an organized bunch of lines." Which, of course, when I had come into the room, I'm ready to say, anyway, this is exactly what you already agree with, but
Yes.
we've done the work for you. And so we thank you. And we still use that standing code.
Well, this is great.
Yes.
And I'm sure I didn't say anything rude about the Writers' Union because that perceptive group made me an honorary member.
Ah.
And now with this book, I plan to earn my passage as a real member, honorary one. So thank you. Well, yes.
I wanted to ask a question. I was just curious about, you mentioned at the beginning the many iterations this talk you gave tonight had when we were first discussing it. So I wanted to go back to the last iteration and ask you what some of the things you learned about the process of writing when you jumped over the aisle to try your hand at it yourself.
Yes. I made the joke, which is no joke, that books don't write themselves. And it's funny because in theory, I should have been ready to write a book, as ready as any other publisher you can think of. I'd written lots of newspaper pieces, often sadly obituaries. I'd written magazine articles, I'd written chapters for books, etc., etc. I'd even, for 3 years, done a weekly CBC Sunday morning movie review and never missed a deadline. So, I knew about meeting deadlines and so on. But somehow, actually writing this proved to be much harder than I expected. And of course, it is, in a sense, it's like 21 miniature biographies. Each chapter, the Hugh MacLennan chapter, is about Hugh MacLennan's career. You've heard Alistair MacLeod, Alice Munro, etc. So it involves researching and getting into the subject of Hugh MacLennan or Pierre Trudeau or whoever it is, and doing that, and then putting that aside, and then it's like another entirely new book. Okay, so now Charles Ritchie, now Mavis Glenn. So I found that hard to get into. And the other trick is in every chapter I deal with the author's career so that it's, I hope, an objective account of what their great books were. And then I fit myself in, and our paths crossed when I worked with Robertson Davies on The Rebel Angels, World of Wonders, etc. And that, I started to get the hang of it. So later chapters went faster than earlier ones. But a major surprise for me, and my wife, who can't stand listening to this, look, she's was that while I had trouble getting started, I couldn't stop. my brain could not turn off. And she's my witness that you cannot name any hour in the 24-hour clock when 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 in the morning, I'd get up and write for 8 hours because I'd be lying there thinking, okay, Robertson Davies, so I'm writing it. At 3 in the morning, I'm writing it in my head. Hell with it, I get up and write it. And I couldn't turn it off until the chapter was finished, and then I could do it. And at one point, my lovely wife said, this is becoming obsessive. And I said, and she was right, and I said, I think this is the way books get written. And I think I was right there too. Now, other more experienced writers may find that, yeah, they can turn it off, yes, they can do it, but I couldn't. So I was just in constant intellectual ferment. Oh, what a thought. Until I finished each chapter and then finished the book, and then I became a decent human being, I hope, again. But it was a great learning experience for me. The other side of the learning experience is, you know, I have an agent, and I send it off to my agent, and I find myself saying, why doesn't my agent get back to me? You know, all of that stuff. And then I've been very well treated by ECW. I have no complaints there at all. But you know, you think, oh God, is this where it goes wrong now? Am I going to quarrel with the editor? No. Jennifer Knock was the editor, and it went really well. So I've had a very pleasant experience.
And how was that experience for you being edited?
Well, it was very pleasant because you know, the old story that a book is improved by an editor saying this isn't clear means that, you know, the improper response is, well, it should be clear. Now this is an intelligent person, it's not clear. Okay, I guess I'd better make it clear. So the old, and you know, I have advanced this argument often enough myself, and I find that it's true. So yes, it was a pleasant, agreeable experience being edited. And the book is now better than it was when it didn't edit. Yes?
If you couldn't turn your mind off, did you have to condense the chapter so it would...
No, I just kept going.
Yeah.
But later on, did you have to take the chapter and condense it back so that it wouldn't, the book wouldn't run 1,100 pages?
No, it was just till I finished it. And the chapters are interesting. Almost all came out at roughly the same, around 7,000 word, whatever. But it was, I can't account for my internal mental machinations, but I found that I just couldn't stop thinking about the book. And you've all heard writers claiming that they're, and I now understand after publishing lots of acknowledgements where people finally say, finally to my spouse who so heroically, I now understand this. They have to deal with this person who is saying, yeah, what? Because they're still writing the book over the toast or over the soup. So interesting. And I would be, I think, a much better... Oh, actually, one of the nice things was that I found that the advice I had given in a purely theoretical way to authors was actually good advice. So over the years, you know, many authors whose books I bought based on the outline would say, as I write it, it's getting away from the outline quite a bit. And I would say, don't worry about it. Books take on a life of their own, and it happens, so just keep going. And I found the book was getting away from the outline. And I thought, oh, okay, don't worry about it. Books take on a life. And that was true. And it would have been horrible if I discovered as an author that I'd been giving wrong advice for 40 years. But that didn't happen. And now, of course, we're getting close to the next part of the author horror, and as Jack and the folks from ECW know, the last chapter, in fact, is what happens when my book is published. And this is a tongue-in-cheek essay that I used to hand out to all of our first-time authors, explaining all the terrible things that routinely happen, Murphy's Law, when your book is published. And I end up by saying I assume that in my exceptional case, none of this will happen. But it will, and I hope I'll be able to grin and bear it. And it's interesting that my decision to do this is based on my conversation with other people in the publishing world. And I said, if I just sit back and allow the highly skilled people at ECW to do the usual promotional stuff, it's entirely predictable, is it not, that I'll get 5 or 6 or 7 reviews. You know, the review organs out there are narrower all the time. And I may get 5 or 6 or 7 interviews on this or that station. And then by, if it comes out in early October, by mid-November, it's all over, right? And everyone's, yeah, basically, that's the way it works. And I said, okay, so I've got to find a way of keeping it rolling and keeping people talking about it. So that's what all this is intended to do. And I've got good news in that Writers' Festivals in Vancouver and Edmonton, Calgary, Banff, Ottawa, and so are all saying, yeah, we'd like to have you do this. So I hope to keep it rolling, and we'll see where else it goes. Yes?
Would there not be a danger, though, that you are so good at your part that people won't bother to buy the book?
I will say, the book is 140,000 words. You've heard perhaps 10,000?
But the best one.
Not necessarily. You missed the whole first half. No, but you're right. I will guard against this. If you really enjoyed it, it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, then you have a table at the back with all your books.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's
And somebody, you know, collects
it gets serious after October. Yes. So I'll
Actually, you can't
see.
get out of the play without buying the book.
And I'm a very tough person in person. So yes, it's going to be interesting.
A lot of us work with authors, writers, who are not very good. Well, that's true. I mean, I work in textbooks, and I have had some manuscripts that are just total dreck, and I essentially rewrite the whole thing, sort of based on what they started with, you know, bringing in from
The book has a life of its own after all.
But you're fortunate in that your people have, and sometimes you get, like in science, which I'm in, you get somebody who really writes well, and you just don't want to do anything with what they've said. It's just so well put together. You're very fortunate then.
Yes. Well, you know the motto that editors should do as much as necessary, but as little as possible. Yeah. Yes, and it helps to have a stone carver like Alistair. My main editorial role with Alistair MacLeod was an interesting, possibly unique one, because he was writing that book for 13 years. And he just kept going, and the result was it was a continuous role, like old-fashioned galley books. And there were no chapters, and no chapter divisions, nothing. And I said, Alistair, would you like me to have a go at cutting it into chapters? He said, yeah. And I'm proud to tell you that I got one paragraph out of place. We agreed that it should be in the preceding or the next, I think it was the preceding chapter. So all of the chapters were my work, and Alistair said, yeah, you're right, that's what I meant. So I was useful as an editor.
How did you come to get your own imprint?
Well, I'd been at Macmillan for a number of years, and I wasn't happy with what was going on there. And Abbie Bennett bought McClelland and Stewart, and as he tells it, he bought it and said to Jack McClelland, okay, I bought the company, what should I do now? Apparently Jack said, I tried to hire, I think he said young Gibson. It was a while ago, it was 1986. I tried to hire young Gibson. And so Abbie did, and he said, what do you want to do? And I thought, gosh, I would love to have an editorial imprint. And so we worked it out, and I joined M&S in March of 1986 as part of the new Abbie Bennett setup. And then September, 18 months later, Abbie came to me and said, look, Adrian Clarkson isn't working out. We'd like you to become publisher of the whole thing. I said, oh no, I've done that. I've done it at Macmillan. It means worrying about who gets which office, about salaries, and yeah, all of that stuff. No, find someone else. And he stayed after me for a week, and eventually said, look, McClelland Stewart's important, we need you. So I said yes. And I managed to sort of keep the imprint going, and but was the publisher overall until 2004. And then went back to just doing my imprint. And there's a Peter Zosky story that I skipped over, and that is that he had been a McClelland and Stewart author, but he knew me, and he said, listen, I'd like to be a Douglas Gibson Books author. And I said, it doesn't work that way, Peter. I can't just take the best authors from the other editors at M&S. You know, I bring people from outside to work with me as Douglas Gibson Book author. And he said, what if I stamped my pretty little foot? So, all right. So you might call it the stamp of approval.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. There will be more opportunity during the mix and mingle portion. There's coffee and tea and snacks over there, and you can continue to chat with Doug in a more informal way. But at the moment, I'm going to formally thank him. As some of you know who are members, some of you may not be aware, rather than giving a substantial gift to our speakers, we give them a small token of our appreciation and then use the money that would otherwise be spent and divide it up among various speakers. We pool that money and we provide it to a charity each year. So this year's charity is Sister Rights. It's a creative writing group that works with homeless and socially and economically marginalized women. So that's where your bottle of wine is.
And I don't drink wine, but I should drink maple syrup.
But what we do, I said there's a small token, so this is a certificate of appreciation. Thank you, Doug.
Very much.
A small magnet. And Rosemary generously donated this maple syrup to you. So Jane tells me your grandchildren will enjoy it. So, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.